received quite a bit of questions as John was presenting, so I'm just going to go over them. Some of them do have similar themes, so I will be combining them together. One of the first questions we received was after the surplus, and then presuming the land will either be leased or sold, is it likely that CSF would use the existing building?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's too early to say. I think the long-term intentions of the CSF would be to build a new school on the site to accommodate a larger number of students than could be accommodated in that building. I'm actually not certain what their immediate use of the site would look like. They may wish to get in there and use the existing facility while they plan for a larger facility in the future.
There's a bit of concern about the potential overcrowding at JQ or in the area in general. So how will the district address a potential surplus in the area or a potential increase in enrollment in the area? Because surplusing the site makes it irreversible. So participants want to know what will be done from the district's perspective if JQ can't handle the number of students or is over capacity.
So thanks again. So I think there's two separate questions in there. One is about school organization for Jules Cornell going forward, and then the other is about the general, what's going on in the area with enrollment. So let's take those one at a time. So with respect to JQ, as part of the due diligence before proposing the closure of the annex, we ensured that we could organize Jules Cornell in a way that would accommodate all students in that school. And I'm sure we'll be successful in doing that, looking at next year's enrollment numbers and enrollment numbers going forward. Remember that Jules Cornell is a district program, and so the enrollment is managed not based on catchment demand, but based on capacity in the program. So it's a different situation. So we don't anticipate enrollment crunch at Jules Cornell. And then I think what we're seeing and what I tried to set out in the enrollment history and forecast is there's all these demographic factors. Particularly on the west side of Vancouver, there's a declining birth rate, there's a declining youth population, and that's reflected in the declining school enrollment. So that the part up to 2022, that's a long-standing historical fact. And fully acknowledging that we did experience an enrollment bump this year, which brings us back to a level of approximately a little bit less than 2019 in that area, but nowhere near where it was, say, 10 years ago or 12 years ago or 15 years ago. So those schools can and have accommodated many more students than they do presently. And as noted, in the schools in that study area alone, there was close to 600 seats of surplus capacity already, and that's not counting the surplus capacity at QEA or Jules Cornell. That's just looking at catchment capacity, because our priority is to accommodate catchment students at their catchment schools. So I think we're in a good position to accommodate quite a bit of enrollment growth. Before you can talk about growth, you've got to stop decline. And if immigration continues for several years, as it has for the past 18 months, it would be great. Enrollment could stabilize in that area, but we're not seeing any indications of actual growth of enrollment in the long term in that area yet. There's two the main leading indicator of enrollment growth is birth rate, because that's sort of a predictor of kindergarten entry, and kindergarten is a determinant of future enrollment at every cohort. So we're not seeing either of those things yet, but we're attentive to them. And I think the second part of the presentation was designed to reassure people about how that enrollment growth, if it did materialize sometime down the road, would be accommodated.
Right, so what you're saying is, in case there is an increase in enrollment, babies start to come and they start to stay in the area, we have sites that are reserved and available for schools to be built on, pending that the funding is available to us from the ministry.
Well, we know there's going to be a big, thanks, Jana, there's going to be a big development at Jericho Lands. And when you do a big development on a piece of land that doesn't have any children coming from it, for sure there's going to be more children, just like there's in Olympic Village, just like there's in Yaletown, just like there's in the Fraser Lands. And then in the surrounding areas, it has been a story of decline, except for UBC. And we have space in our schools now to accommodate any increase that materializes in the coming years.
So it's also speaking about enrollment. there's some questioning about the accuracy of our enrollment forecast, particularly when looking at the provincial forecast and our forecast. The province is saying that there will be an increase in enrollment, but we're saying that there's going to be a decrease. Can you address why is there that difference, and which one is supposed to be accurate?
Yeah, and you know what? I guess this is my professional work life, so I'm immersed in this stuff, but I can totally see why these two apparently divergent forecasts would be confusing to folks. So, I mean, I think in general, we have to have some humility about forecasts, but I will say that especially until recently, when, you know, I mentioned how disruptive COVID has been to a number of things. I mean, everybody knows how disruptive COVID has been to almost every aspect of life, including, you know, accurate enrollment forecasting. So in front of me, I have a sort of a 10 or 11 year history of our year-over-year accuracy of enrollment forecasting. So in general, for the district, we were below, you know, within 0.5%. You know, 2012, 0.5% was the accuracy of our year-over-year enrollment forecast. 0.2%, 0.1%. 1 year we were off by 4 students. 0.4, 0.2, 0.7, and then in 2020, 0.8%. 2021, 1.9%, and 2022, 3.5%. You know, above our baseline forecast. So clearly, there's some things going on, particularly with immigration and fast-moving changes in migration patterns, frankly, that are not being fully captured by the forecasting model. And we're aware of that, and we've actually reported on it extensively at the Facilities Planning Committee. And so we believe that enrollment forecasting will return to a more stable, you know, more stable, predictable levels in future years. So that's sort of our piece. So we have a history of validity, I think, and it has been disrupted, but we're still forecasting decline. And then, you know, looking at the ministry piece, they are forecasting growth of about 500 students for the entire district. And this area represents about 10% of the district, maybe. So, you know, if their forecast is correct, we're looking at a growth of maybe 50 students per year in that area. But I'm not sure we're going to see that because, you know, we have validated our forecast. And the way you go about validating a forecast is you go back and you find an old one and you look to see how accurate it was. So I went back to the 2011 ministry forecast for the district. And one thing to understand is the ministry does not do forecasts for local areas like we do, or for catchment schools. So they produce one number for the district. And they do a 10-year forecast similar to what we do. So in 2011, the ministry forecast VSB enrollment in 2021 would be 56,779. In 2011, the VSB forecast enrollment for the district in 21 to be 50,449. So there's the ministry forecast over 6,000 additional students compared with what we forecast. Well, first of all, both forecasts were high because I don't think either took into account the impact of demographic change fully or the impact of housing affordability. But in 2021, our actual enrollment, which was a bit low because of COVID, was 47,386. So the differential there from the ministry side is 9,400 students. So they were 9,400 students high. That's close to 20% of our enrollment. That's not a useful forecast in terms of long-term planning. And the VSB forecast was 3,000 students high. So, you know, 3 times or much more accurate. And I probably won't go into the data sources and the methodology differences right now with this answer, but there are significant differences in approaches. The ministry has recently changed their methodology for forecasting and are still forecasting, you know, a divergent forecast from us, but closer than it has been in past years. But once again, I think, you know, we have to be humble about forecasts, but we do have a record of much better accuracy, which means, you know, did we hit the mark, and validity, which is the same thing, and reliability, which means are we seeing the same thing year over year? Whereas if you look back at the ministry forecast, you'll see they change substantially from year to year to year. So once again, appreciate the question.
And is it true that when looking at capital funding, the ministry uses our forecast rather than their own forecast? So that just kind of shows the accuracy of our.
Absolutely, Jana, and you know, it's a good point because we wish that the ministry actually funded enrollment based on their own forecasts, but they actually fund it on, you know, our head count, which we know is accurate. So anything historical that we provide is accurate actual headcount numbers. And then, yeah, when we do detailed capital planning, feasibility studies for new schools, they're relying on our forecasts, not their own forecasts, because once again, a detailed study for a school relies on catchment forecasting in surrounding schools, just like we did for the study area here, rather than a broad-based district forecast.
Questions around the use of numbers for particular years. So I've seen a couple of questions about why use the 2017 numbers versus the 2011 numbers. So the comment was that there was a trend, and although that says it's not factual, the comment is saying, can you explain the real reason why there's an up and down enrollment figures between 2011 and 2017, and why is 2017 number not shown?
Well, I think probably what's at the heart of this question is the use of data standards, and so the standard I chose to use for this information was I looked at 10 years in the past for the district and 15 years into the future for the district, and for the local area I chose 5 years in the past and 10 years into the future. We do have VSB open data, so we're not attempting to hide anything here. I don't know about the trend that Gianna was describing. In other words, what happened in 2011 versus 2017, but I am pretty confident in saying that there's been an overall decline, historical decline in that area for the last 10 years. So there's nothing particularly special about 2017 versus 2015 versus 2013 or 2011 or any other year you could pick from the past.
So I guess to extend that question, because in the closure information, we said that there's an 8.4% decline from 2011 to 2021. Mm-hmm. And so that was when it was considered, but now we're starting at 2017. So why not start at the same year?
Well, first of all, we're past the closure consideration. But I would say that, and the closure consideration occurred a year ago. So we had a year less data to draw upon, but we chose a 10-year, we looked at 2011 versus 2021. And now, as I said, we looked at 10 years for the district, 2012 to 2023. And we chose 5 years for the local area. There's open data right on our website, so you can go back and look at historical data from further back.
Some questions about capacity. So again, QEA site has more than double capacity that is not effectively being utilized. Can you please explain why the second track of K-3 French immersion or dual track English catchment is not being used for the QEA site?
I'm happy to answer that question, but I want to note that it's outside the scope of the use of that school is outside the scope of what a surplus declaration is about. I can't remember the exact year, but I believe the annex stopped enrolling English students around 2014. Regardless, it stopped enrolling English students because there was no demand. There was insufficient catchment demand to support both an annex and the main elementary school. The main elementary school has quite a bit of surplus capacity now, so it would make sense in terms of resource allocation. It wouldn't be efficient or effective to continue running an annex. And then I wasn't here for the planning phases of how this annex became part of the École Jules Quinnell French immersion program, but I expect the decision was based on wanting to expand that program, knowing that there is actually quite a bit of attrition on grade 4 to 7. So there's an opportunity to run additional kindergarten cohorts and consolidate the program at Jules Quinnell in grade 4 and maximize the program enrollment in that way.
That was back then, and now kind of the enrollment trend has sort of changed where Jules Quinnell can accommodate all of the French demand in that area. Well,
to be accurate, the demand so let's not conflate catchment demand and district program enrollment demand. So with catchment demand, there is no planning case or business case for enrolling English students at Queen Elizabeth Annex when they can be fully accommodated at the main catchment school. And then with respect to Jules Quinnell and the consolidation of Queen Elizabeth Annex, yes, the students coming from Queen Elizabeth Annex can and will be accommodated at Jules Quinnell, as was well set out in the closure process. And there is, the one negative that was set out during that process from the perspective of the community is there will be some years when there will not be a 3 kindergarten cohort intake. Having said that, the overall intake of French immersion students, in the surrounding schools has been maintained, and its demand has diminished for the program now over years as well. So in terms of equitable allocation of resources, it seems like a reasonable thing to do. But once again, this is beyond the surplus declaration conversation and back to the closure conversation.
So this kind of ties into the next question, which is, why does enrollment growth in the area matter if French immersion is a district-wide choice program without any boundaries or catchment?
Yeah, well, that's I'm not sure what the asker of that question had in mind, but I think the surplus declaration policy, just like the closure policy, is actually framed around closing a catchment school. So this closure process and this surplus declaration process are a little bit different than that very reason. It's a district program where we manage enrollment. So that's an astute observation.
Can you explain why Jules Cornell operating capacity has been misstated and why the fact that the QEA students being added would exceed the maximum capacity of Jules Cornell? I think you maybe addressed this at the closure rather than at the surplus, but this was a question for a participant.
Well, I'm not sure. Let me reiterate the main point, which is that we're going to accommodate Atlantic students at Jules Cornell, and there's probably going to be a spare enrolling space in the coming school year based on what I'm seeing. So that's thing one. And then I'm not sure what the questioner means by the capacity has been misstated. I believe the operating capacity of Jules Cornell is 398, but this is where a number of operating capacity, which was really just a sort of planning metric that's used to communicate with the Ministry of Education, can take on a bit of a life of its own, which doesn't have anything to do with how we organize schools. So we organize schools around the number of available classroom spaces, and we ensure that all classes are organized in compliance with the collective agreement. So, and that was all set out pretty clearly through the closure process. So, say in a couple of years from now, there was a third kindergarten cohort enrolled at Jules Cornell, that may well push it above 398. But we know that school can accommodate more than 398 students because it's done so in the past. And lots of schools operate above that official ministry operating capacity. And there's no maximum number stipulated for what a school can accommodate. The limiter on accommodating students in a school is the number of classroom spaces and class size and composition regulations in the collective agreement.
So I guess on that topic with Jules Cornell, a question is, how does the district determine ancillary services for a school besides enrolling classroom space? JQ is pretty big for its available space, and it makes yard discipline, which I'm not sure yard discipline maybe outside more difficult.
Yeah, and then once again, this is getting pretty far afield from the surplus declaration process. But and the real expert on that is the school principal, and I know that I've addressed that issue on multiple occasions during the closure process.
There's some questions about the engagement. Let me just try and scroll quickly to it. I saw, okay, please explain the statement of consultation engagement happening in February made as background for this session. There was very little communication of any type in February before the closure vote. So if I am clear, this is about the surplus and why we talked about the engagement activities happening in February. And so when I said that there's multiple engagement opportunities, it's because, we've reached out to the 3 nations, we met with stakeholders, we've had 2 information sessions with the community, and the community can also submit their feedback through email as well as survey. So if you can't make one of the session, like the information session, you can still submit your feedback on your own time through the survey and through the email feedback channel. Question about seismic safety. Why is seismic safety being raised when QEA has 1 story and a door in every single room, and whereas the EJQ has a long hallway and 3 stories? Basically, they're saying that they feel because QEA is a 1-story building, it's more seismically safe versus Jules Cornell, which is a 3-story building. They also say that QE, Queen Elizabeth, also has multi-stories and long hallways. but QE is not part of this conversation, not part of the surplus conversation. So I guess maybe can you address why would QEA be less seismically safe than Jules Cornell, given that QEA is a 1-story building and Jules Cornell is a 3-story building?
Sure thing. So, preface my response by saying I'm not a structural engineer and I don't do the design work for seismic projects, but take the point that seismic safety is a very important concern of parents, rightly so, and it's a top long-range facilities planning priority for the district. So although Jules Cornell is a 3-story building and it is an older school, it's a completed seismic project. So the building structure has been upgraded to a standard of safety much higher than Elizabeth Annex or other seismically schools at high risk. So Jules Cornell is a seismically safe school, and there's also, at the same time as the seismic upgrades were made, there was a considerable additional piece of new construction put onto that building. With respect to 1 floor and a door in every classroom, those ratings are done by teams of engineers that specialize in doing ratings of schools all over the province. So I'm confident in the seismic risk rating for Elizabeth Annex, and I'm confident that Jules Cornell is a more seismically safe facility. So I'm glad that students from Elizabeth Annex will be in a more seismically safe facility, and that we're optimizing the use of that facility.
Can you explain why secondary information is being mixed into the analysis? Explain why you use aggregate statistics, and also this person who commented thinks that the surplus decision should be based on primary school, specifically for annexes, so K to 3 stats.
So once again, reiterating that there is VSB open data, which is an available source of all sorts of data that if people wish to dig into that. In some ways, we're responding to the policy requirements. So the policy requires a district future enrollment is a consideration. So to be in alignment with the policy requirement, that's why district enrollment is presented. And I interpret district enrollment to be K to 12. But we went further because we wanted to do a legitimate forecast for elementary enrollment, because that's what is at play here. And so we went further and did a K to 7 aggregate forecast for the surrounding schools. And the data is available for each of those schools if they want to be looked at separately. But in a general sense, UBC behaves one way, where Norma Rose Point has one enrollment pattern. It's very distinct from all the other schools in that study area, including U Hill Elementary. So could parse that out, but that wouldn't change the overall picture. And as I say, we're responding to the policy while trying to provide a reasonable amount of information for the community to work with. And with respect to, looking at annexes, I'm not clear on what that would look like. In this case, we're consolidating the annex into the main school for all the reasons that were listed through the closure process.
A follow-up question on what you said earlier about operating capacity or the maximum capacity. So is the presenter suggesting that the operating maximum has been documented for Jules Cornell is not the real number? Can you clarify why QA operating capacity often is quoted and yet J2 capacity is not relevant?
Well, I'm going to try to read between the lines here with that question. The operating capacity, there's no maximum capacity. So in this case, words do matter. So it's an operating capacity, and it's defined based on the number of classrooms. And those metrics are pretty clearly laid out in the long-range facilities plan and elsewhere. The operating capacity, I believe, for Queen's Annex is 98, and the operating capacity for Jules Cornell is 398. And if I answered the question insufficiently, I will need more clarification from the person asking the question.
I guess from my perspective, it's you're saying that the maximum capacity can go over or the operating capacity can go over for any school, really, right? And for Jules Cornell, it can go over, and for QEA, it can go over too. I like just to clarify.
No, I'm saying that operating capacity is a ministry-defined metric that's used in their capital branch for planning purposes, and is useful as a beginning point for looking at, how many students could a school reasonably, accommodate. But it's not the end point, because when we organize schools, we organize them around classroom space, and it's not a maximum capacity. It's not even a guideline. It's simply a number used for planning purposes. So there's no attempt to mislead, obviously. The operating capacities have been clearly stated on many occasions, and the organizational, the organization of Jules Cornell has been described also in several places.
Right, yeah. During the closure, we actually had a graphic showing the school organization of Jules Cornell, of Queen Elizabeth, to show in terms of operating capacity versus the actual physical space and how to accommodate that. And if participants want to see that graphic, it's at govsb.ca/QEA, and under documents and data, you'll be guided through there, and you'll see how that space can be organized with the QEA schools population going into Jules Cornell School. Question about the demand. So this person believes that the demand is heavily understated due to structural issues with the choice programs, masking the real demand, issues with management of schools leading to lower than long-term optimal market share, and also pandemic impacts. So they're asking, have we considered these factors when looking into the surplus consideration?
Well, most of those factors were well articulated through the closure process. The closure report contains a lot of detail about historical enrollment demand for the program and how we'll maintain enrollment in the future. It is a district choice program, and so we've demonstrated both those things. I guess to reiterate, the number of across the district, the number of kindergarten cohorts for French immersion has been sustained at 19 for many years. And there is a bit of an imbalance. 12 of those are west of Granville. So there's a bit of inequity there in the way things are currently structured. And then of those 12, 7 are sort of located in the surrounding area of 7K cohorts are located, in and around Jules Cornell. So that would be Kilchenna and Kerrisdale and Trafalgar and so on. So if you look back at the closure report, you'll see that there's not a commitment, but there's the intention to retain 7. So this year there was an additional cohort added at Trafalgar to compensate September 2023 for the loss of a kindergarten intake cohort at Jules Cornell going that year. And it's mapped out for the next few years how 7 could be retained. The number one thing that limits French immersion in a very real way is the availability of staff. So that's a governor of program. So those are the facts. Lots of things can influence parental choice, including some of the things the questioner set out, but those are the facts. And I suppose, there's sort of a reference to market share. I'm not really sure what exactly that meant with respect to French immersion, but just say that market share is stable, meaning that we're not seeing a flight to independent schools.
And to clarify, market share are students who are living in the area but decide to go to an independent school.
Yeah.
Okay. A question about land value. So have staff or trustees considered the massive rising land value and how it may not be strategically or financially responsible to divert public land assets?
So I think everybody's aware of the incredible escalation of land values in Vancouver. That discussion would be part of the disposition process, which is, again, we're at the surplus declaration stage. The negotiation at the CS, ultimately there's a negotiation. The site is declared surplus, and there's a negotiation with the CSF and the Ministry of Education about the value of the land. I'm sure everybody will be alive to its real value. And ultimately, the board makes the decision on whether or not to dispose of the site and whether or not the proposed terms of disposal are to their satisfaction. So I think people are, very aware of escalating land value and the permanence of either a long-term lease or outright fee simple disposal.
I would say if that's a factor, of concern for participants to put that in your feedback during the survey or email to trustees. So everything collected will help inform the trustees' decision by April 11th when they do make that decision. A question about back to elementary enrollment. So elementary enrollment, they've seen a decline of 2.7 over 10 years, whereas secondary is seeing 19%. It seems skewed to use this aggregate. Like you said earlier, you addressed it, you're looking at the whole district context because you're doing this as per policy requirements to look at it from a district perspective. But in addition to that, you went over and beyond the policy requirements and looked at the local area of elementary schools in that, and you did see that it is declining.
Yeah, so exactly. So no, again, not cherry picking data to present certain viewpoint. As Janet just indicated, used elementary enrollment locally, and would be, it's no trouble to look at elementary enrollment separate from secondary enrollment at the district level, because we have open data available for everybody to look at that. But it's not really that relevant to surplus decision, which is a local decision in terms of where students would actually want to go to school. They want to go to school near to where they live. That's the reality, and that was the attempt in the surplus declaration report to represent that. And there is elementary enrollment decline. And in the bigger picture, what happened in the VSB was, the number of students coming in kindergarten diminished quite rapidly for several years. And for several years, there was a lot of enrollment decline at elementary. And then as those smaller cohorts worked their way through, in recent years, the enrollment decline has been more felt at secondary. And now what we have is a pretty flat situation where, most of the cohorts are about the same size. So it just took a long time for that declining enrollment to fully work its way through the system. So the questioner is quite right that most of the decline in the last 5 or 6 years has been at secondary. But nonetheless, there's elementary enrollment decline and surplus capacity around the QEA site.
And the growth rate shows us that.
And the underlying demographics, show that maybe the trend that plays out in the future.
So I'm aware it's 4:59. So we've answered actually most of the questions in here, which is good that we were able to answer participants' questions. There's one more kind of major theme, or two people have asked the same questions, which is about why we keep referring, why we refer to the closure, but then we're narrowing our scope to just the surplus. And I guess to address that is because we've gone through the closure process already, and the board has decided to close the school. So now we're in the next phase. Like I said earlier in the presentation, we are considering the surplus. And what we really want to know is how should we inform the board about alternative community use? And that's what we really are here today, to gather that type of feedback for the board. There was also a technical question about having trouble signing in and having to use this person's computer instead of the phone. And just to address this publicly, we haven't received any concerns or complaints about logging in, unlike the first session. There was one email that we received and we responded, and since then I believe that person has joined on. So for today, everyone that we haven't heard anyone having trouble signing in that one. They have been signed up. So with that, it is 5 o'clock. I thank everyone for participating. Again, all the information is on govsb.ca/QEA surplus. That link is missing the .ca. If you have any questions, that the information is on there. And again, we encourage you to submit your feedback through the survey, which is live until tomorrow, as well as the email engage@vsb.bc.ca. Thank you and have a good evening.